Nuclear war wouldn't be much fun, would it? You don't really need me to tell you that. We all know what a nuclear strike would be like. It'd be shit.
Come on, quick, get down!
We've got the cultural memory of the strikes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the horror of entire cities razed, a horror that led to anti-nuclear movements around the world. And that terror about nuclear war it's kind of ebbed and flowed for different people in different countries over the last 80 years. These days, in Western countries, it feels, to be honest, kind of like the spectre of nuclear conflict is closer than it's been for decades, thanks to that lovely Vladimir Putin chap. Well, back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, at the peak of the Cold War between the USA and the USSR, it was an inescapable possibility, almost a reality. I dimly remember the huge protest marches, and I was in some way vaguely aware that this thing called nuclear war could happen one day. It could happen tomorrow. It could even happen here in the UK.
Disaster. If we act resolutely and show both the Russians and the Americans
that terror wasn't just for the bombs themselves, terrifying though the bombs were, it's what those bombs would unleash, what they would cause to ripple out across society, the long-term devastation, as this episode's guest on Your Brain on Climate explains.
It was actually that much more complex if you went back in time. So even in the 70s and 80s, governments were still basically communicating in a way that basically said, look, nuclear weapons, they're just bigger bombs. They're just bigger bombs, guys. Sure. That means that if a war happens, all the cities will get blown up and so on and so forth, but they're just bigger bombs. And there's a very interesting British director called Mick Jackson. You may know him because he directed The Bodyguard. I will always love you. Yes, and I've never actually sung on a podcast before. Maybe, yeah. So
will that make it into the edit? That's
that's a very big question.
So that's Laurie Laybourn. Laurie is head of the Strategic Climate Risks Initiative. We're going to be talking to him a lot more. He spends a lot of time thinking about the end of the world and how the hell we might get our head around it. Now,
he also directed a BBC straight-to-TV film called Threads.
Threads.
Which is one of the most devastating things, if anyone's ever seen it. Which
legendarily terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah. Legendarily terrifying. Now, the very interesting about Mick is that before he did Threads, he actually did something that isn't really remembered anymore, which is a documentary called When the Bomb Drops. And what that did is it looked at a hypothetical situation, which is a sort of a Hiroshima-style nuclear atomic bomb was dropped and exploded just above St. Paul's Cathedral in London. And it looked at what happened second after second after second after second, right? And as he was making this, he thought, well, hang on a minute. The biggest impacts of these bombs are not necessarily the immediate impact of them. They're just bigger bombs. It blows up London, whatever. It's the knock-on impacts. And he thought about that more and more, and he realised that the greatest impact of these things would be the fact that they would shred the delicate threads holding together societies. And that's what led him to make this film. And what he was, the film Threads, which plays out the process leading up to then the nuclear war, and then really the process afterwards where the supply chains break down, where society falls to pieces, people lose the ability to speak and so on and so forth. It is horrifying. And he was helped because only a few months before they made Threads, academic papers came out that established the concept of nuclear winter, which was the idea that, again, it wasn't just the immediate impact of the bombs, it was the fact that they ejected vast amounts of rubbish into the atmosphere and it blocked out the sun, and then the crops would die, and then there would be the cascading effect of a lack of food. Now, the point that I'm making here is that all of those things that I just described, they're all complex, they're all extremely scary, they all rub up against our psychological, emotional biases and barriers, right? But they had a massive impact. And I think still the largest physical protests ever, at least in America, in one place, were the march that came out in New York against nuclear weapons in the early 80s, against at the time President Reagan's policies on nuclear weapons. The nuclear movement was huge, and it had a massive knock-on impact on the culture. It wasn't just Threads. And I'm of a generation born at the very end of the 80s, after the US and Soviet Union declared that nuclear war cannot be won and must not be fought. My conception of nuclear war is of utter apocalypse. It's not that it's bigger bombs. It incorporates all of these risks into one package of nightmare that is clear to me has to be avoided, and means that I get particularly worried by what's happening at the moment with Russia and America. And all of this shows us that we can break through some of those when it comes to these bigger risks, but we have got at the moment a lack of some of the things we had then, which is proper representation of all those complex risks, the cultural outputs of really bring them alive for people, and how those are then connected with many of the climate movements that have done a great job years ago but need their next wind of energy to help us really push back against these risks.
Now, Laurie brought up a BBC film from 1984 called Threads.
We are confident that the Soviet Union will take note of our resolve and will desist from its present perilous course of action.
You may have heard of it, or maybe, like me at the time I chatted to Laurie, you know it by reputation. It's gone down in folklore as being, as I said there, legendarily terrifying. I hadn't seen it, I knew it depicted a nuclear strike on Britain and what happened next. And I knew that it cast fear into the heart of the entire nation, other people in other countries, and helped to increase anti-nuclear sentiment and protest in the UK. There were even rumours that Ronald Reagan himself had seen it, and it affected his posturing with Gorbachev. But I hadn't actually seen it, so before editing this episode together, thanks to Laurie's provocation, I sat down to watch it. And all I can say is, bloody hell. Welcome to Your Brain on Climate. I'm Dave, and this is a show all about human brains and how they make sense of the big stuff in the world, or don't, definitely including climate change. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking to Laurie Laybourn all about the big stuff, the end of the world, the existential risks caused by climate change and other things, and why it is our governments and we aren't really thinking about them. So what's going on here? Are we just happy-go-lucky, optimistic little monkeys, just not evolved to think about the possibility of all this going wrong? And what the hell do we do about that, if so? Now look, this episode ain't started in the cheeriest way, and before we go any further, I want to reassure you that this chat is nowhere near as morbid as you might be fearing. Laurie is a genial and kind chap, and tempting though it would be to spend the entire show getting him to list all the ways climate change is going to mess our shit up, other than a bit of that at the start, we mostly talk about the psychology of why humans find it hard to think about everything going awry, how hard it is to get your head around the end of the world. And if you are the type who likes seriously digging into existential risks, good luck to you, then do check out Laurie's work on this. There's a link in the show notes, and that's what that owl noise is telling you there. I hope you find this chat fascinating as I did. I'm so interested in how we can collectively and individually get our head around the very real possibility of things going askew, so that we can collectively do something about it before it actually does. So on with it. And this episode's guest, Laurie Laybourn from the Strategic Climate Risks Initiative, is one of the smartest, wisest and kindest people I've ever met. I know you're going to love getting to know him. He's an expert in existential climate risk. And so before we went much further, I thought I'd better find out what existential climate risk means.
Your brain on climate.
So it means that lives, entire worlds could be destroyed. I say worlds plural there because there's a lot of existential risk already manifesting around the world. If you are in one of the many places that has been smashed to pieces by the climate crisis, then that existential risk has become existential reality. But at the largest scale, existential risk could mean a threat to the world, to the overall human species. And there is existential risk when it comes to climate change on that bigger scale, not necessarily directly in that some mega storm is going to kill us all, or fires are going to destroy the entire planet, but because climate change makes all the other risks that could become existential even worse. It supercharges them, right? So war, conflict, all of the things that we have as humans worried about for a very long time that could be existential are made themselves worse by climate change. So that's why I think we could perceive climate change as presenting some of those existential risks at that grander scale.
So look, before we get into all of that thoroughly cheery and uplifting stuff, why are you interested in this? What is it about this floats your boat?
I'm interested in it because I think that we really have underestimated how bad climate change is. And that sounds ludicrous, right? You pick up a newspaper or you hear your mate down the pub talking about how bad it is and you think, oh, okay, this is really bad. But where it matters most, like in the halls of power in government or in key companies and other institutions like your pension fund, they are doing risk assessments that are missing some of those worse risks. So I'm interested, a lot of my work is focused on how, where it matters most, we are worrying least about the things that really, really are risky when it comes to climate change.
Have you always been someone who's been drawn to the end of the world?
I mean, I think it's a very good question. I took a gap year. I didn't spend that gap year travelling before I went to university. I spent it working in a supermarket to save up money to be able to go to university. And when I was doing so, I thought, well, hang on a minute. In my lunch breaks, I've got to actually spend some time to get to better understand the world properly. So my first contact with climate change really was being the guy who was sat in the corner in the Waitrose canteen on my lunch break, reading the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report at that time.
Every workplace has one of those.
I know. He's always there in the corner. There's a layer of dust settling on him. And but I thought, well, hang on a minute. I'm going to take this time that I've got on this gap year. I'm going to be working 5 days a week in the supermarket and I'm going to read these things. And I remember looking at that and being like, it doesn't get much bigger than this. And I grew up with family members who'd focused on the previous generation's biggest risks, the biggest threats, particularly things like nuclear war. And I thought, well, this is my generation's one and many other generations' one. So for me, for whatever reason, I've always thought that the thing to do, at least for my career, is to focus on the biggest threat, the biggest thing that we need to deal with. I don't think it gets much bigger than this.
Is it safe to eat?
I don't know. How can you tell? It's got a thick coat. That should have protected it.
You breathe it in there, don't you?
It should be all right.
Well, do you remember we started this show talking about the sodding, terrifying drama from the 80s called Threads? And what made that programme so scary isn't just the horror of, like, a nuke falling on Sheffield, which would be bad. It's what happens next. The unravelling of things, the unravelling of the threads that hold us together. And the film is ultimately about that fragility of modern life, how delicately interdependent and interconnected everything is, and how one massive nuclear bomb could cause not just the immediate death and destruction, it's probably quite easy to call to mind, but a whole network of things falling apart that perhaps it's a bit harder, like crops failing, the famine that would result. So when Laurie's talking about existential climate risk, that's the kind of thing he really means. We can probably find it easy, if unpleasant, to get our head round what rising temperatures means in terms of more wildfires or droughts or even floods. These are bad, but if you like, they're the immediate impacts of climate change, the things that will be in our face and already happening. But in our densely networked, just-in-time world, climate change is going to have cascading knock-on effects in ways that I find hard to get my head around. So I gave Laurie strict instructions not to bum people out too much. But I did ask him to sketch out a little bit of the complicated ways this might all fall apart and how to start thinking about it. Right, okay, so let's do it. Let's get into this. Let's get it out of the way. Give us a few different types of really scary existential climate risk, or the ways in which climate change adds scariness onto other risks. Try and keep it light, Laurie, if you can.
Well, okay, the way I'm going to do this is I'm actually going to introduce into our yours and hopefully our listeners' minds here an image, a sort of image, a way of seeing the world that can help you all think about this into the future, right? So imagine you're on a ship with your mates, a boat, right? And you're chugging along, it's a lovely day, and on the horizon is a massive storm. And a couple of you have noticed that storm. And your job is to alert people to the existence of the storm, and then you'll all work together on the boat to change the bearing, and then you'll ultimately avoid it. You'll sail around it, right? And the way I've described that scene is the way we talk about climate change often. And what we specifically do is say, look, we don't want the boat to go into the storm, the boat here representing the world or a given country, the storm representing the climate crisis. We don't want to go into it because of the immediate impacts of the storm on the boat, right? You don't want to have your boat in the storm because it will get smashed up. And that's primarily how we perceive climate risk. We worry about the immediate impacts on the world, on our countries, on our communities, the storms, the heat waves, etc. And they are very scary. And we've seen that already this year. You know, think back to the beginning of January, the dominant headline at the time with the fires playing out in California. That's that immediate impact, the literal and figurative consequence of the climate storm on that area of the world. But the really scary ones, I think, the ones that really are concerning as we look into the future are the knock-on consequences, the cascading effects of those immediate things. So it's not just the fact that the storm is hitting the boat or the fact that the wildfire is burning down a bit of the world. It is then the ripple effects that has. It's not just the destruction of, say, crops by wildfires. It is then the fact that causes a spike in food prices, which cannot be contained to one place. That ripples around the world. And we've seen that in recent years where inflation, where the cost of goods that we rely on have become more expensive. It's those knock-on risks that I am really concerned about, those cascading risks.
Some of which are political as well, right? You did a post, I think it was today or yesterday as we record, talking about the sort of doom loop that happens when you get politicians saying in order to deal with climate change, we need less government. And so you get less government. And so therefore you do less about climate change, which means you get more climate change.
Precisely. So, and this, let me take you back then to the boat analogy. So it is not just the immediate impacts of the storm that we need to be worrying about. We do. And the boat needs to be more robust. It is not then just the knock-on, the cascading consequences. So when you're on the boat, it's not just the fact that a wave is crashing over the boat. It is the fact that there is the knock-on consequence of that, say, I don't know, washing a couple of the lifeboats overboard and causing a lot of fear among the crew. Those are those cascading consequences. But the next, even more concerning bit is that will have an impact back onto your ability to work together to change the bearing of the boat and ultimately get out of this situation that's getting much worse for you. So the example that you gave there, the one that I wrote about, was that as those wildfires tore through California, through Los Angeles, they tore through communities that are suffering from a lack of fire services, from a lack of proper resilience to all of these kind of impacts. And that led to a situation where those communities were devastated. There was a lot of people who understandably were themselves emotionally, economically devastated by that experience. And that created room for people with a certain political persuasion in the US to say, look, the reason why this has been so bad is because the federal government is doing things wrong and it has all these weird policies. A lot of this is conspiracy stuff. But what that could be doing is having the effect of leading to a justification of a situation where the government is further rolled back. And we can't afford to do that because it's only government that can really respond to disasters of the scale that we're beginning to see. And you can see how that creates this vicious circle or doom loop where the worsening consequences of the climate crisis create situations that distract us from then dealing with the causes in exactly the same way that when you're in a boat in a storm, you could become so inundated by the effects of the storm, by the fact that the crew are freaking out and no longer want to work together to change the bearing, that you get lost and you head deeper into the storm and then you really are in deep trouble.
This is what victory feels like. Yeah! And this was no ordinary victory. This was a fork in the road of human civilization.
In the technical language, we call it derailment risk, the idea that we could be derailed from a viable path to ultimately dealing with the climate crisis, or we could be derailed from our ability to navigate the ship out of the storm. And yes, there is a nightmare future in which every country is so bound up with handling the symptoms of climate change, right? They are putting up even more walls because they're worried about people who have been forcibly displaced by climate disasters. They are striking out of their countries to grab what resources are left. This is a kind of nightmarish, Trumpian on steroids type of world in which this doom loop has really kicked into gear. But there are so many things we can do to break out of that. We did a bunch of work where we did actually chat to some people who have sailed boats and tried to avoid storms, and they all said to us, well, the strategy is to avoid them. And we said, yes, we accept that that's the case. That does sound like the most sensible thing to do. But then they said, okay, but once you're in the storm, there are a number of things that you need to do. And one of them is to have, the equivalent of a better radar, the ability to see these things, to spot them just before they hit you and to spot the ones that you might still be able to avoid, right? So imagine being buffeted in a storm. You might not be able to avoid that particular eddy or big wave, but you can predict it a little bit more in advance of time to make sure you're ready to handle it. But you're also better able to predict the ones that you definitely need to steer clear of, right? In this difficult process of getting out of the mess that you're in. There are a bunch of other things that we might be able to unpack over the course of our conversation, but a really important one, and maybe the most important one, was that there had to be a shared story among the people on the boat. They had to have a shared basis of understanding the predicament they were in and then having a shared belief about how they might be able to do that. And some of the stories of how people have been in storms or indeed abandoned, they're shipwrecked at sea, they are astonishing stories of people who have had to go through this psychological process, this emotional process of realizing that the best strategy of avoiding that situation, they failed in it, and that is devastating. They have to go through that very difficult process to then click into the gear of the motivation, the belief that they will be able to get out of it, because crucially, this is the crucial point, they have to believe, to motivate themselves to undertake the actions that will ultimately realize what they are believing in, that they ultimately get out of it. And I think that we are collectively, some countries more than others, some communities more than others, yet to go through that emotional process of realizing that we didn't avoid a global scale climate emergency situation. We're now in that. We are in a new climate reality in that regard. And our stories before were saying basically, if we do that implicitly or sometimes explicitly, the world it will end. We have to go through the emotional process of understanding that that's not the case, that things are just much more complicated and difficult and hard. It does not mean that it's over, but we need to develop the different stories and beliefs to go through the similar process that those that get stuck in storms at sea have to go through themselves.
Your brain on climate.
So I'm recording this a month or so after those fires in Los Angeles that captivated the world. They were horrific. They still are horrific. I think they're ongoing. They captured the raw power of a climate system that is pissed off and is showing the world who's boss. To me, they felt like a feverish planet lashing out in night sweats. The very wealth and powerlessness of Los Angeles made it a particularly powerful story, didn't it, of how humble mankind will be in the eye of the climate storm. And of course, they're just one example of fires and other devastating climate impacts happening all around the world, including in much poorer and more vulnerable countries and peoples than in the USA. Now, it's tempting to think, isn't it, that horror shows like those fires will permanently change how people think about climate change, that they'll be more worried about it and more ready to act. And a US poll conducted after the worst of the fires found that 58% of Americans think climate change had something to do with it, which, to be clear, it did. But that doesn't mean we change our mindsets about the gravity and the complexity of climate change overnight, unfortunately. Our relationship to natural disasters in which climate has had a hand but isn't singularly responsible is complicated. There's loads on this in my friend George Marshall's book, Don't Even Think About It, which is about the psychology of climate change and why it's difficult. It was written a decade ago now. And in that book, George, amongst other things, visits communities in the States who have been devastated by disasters, including Hurricane Sandy, which scientists can say with confidence was turbocharged by climate change. You might have expected that people who'd lost everything in the storm turned into climate activists overnight, but of course that isn't how it works. As George writes, the hope and the optimism that you need to rebuild to pull yourself back together again after a terrible disaster actually makes you, if anything, less likely to want to countenance that it could ever happen again.
After losing all of his stock during Hurricane Sandy, Brian George, the owner of North Shore Menswear in Seabright, hung a sign outside his shop saying, "We love Seabright, we'll be back." After he reopened, business was great, he said, with many people buying something simply to thank him for staying. He accepted that climate change could bring more disasters, but says he's resigned to it. "This is my home," he said. "And I guess we're just hoping another one doesn't come along anytime soon."
So when Laurie says we need a story that there's a storm coming, a story we all buy into, does that really work for something as planetary as climate change? And is its bigness the problem? And I suppose one of the things I've always found a little bit challenging with the analogy of something like sailing a boat into a storm, where we can imagine being in that situation and suddenly looking around and going, oh, Christ, we're in this storm now, and that is bad. There is definitely a point when you are in a storm. Does climate change really work like that, though? Because it's not the kind of thing where you wake up one morning and suddenly you have unimpeachably entered in your brain a climate change world. It's much more kind of subtle and connected than that. It's a thing that's happening in the background. So how likely is it, I guess, that we are going to wake up one day and go, right, okay, that's it. We're definitely in this climate change storm now. We need to do something about it.
I mean, I think that certain events are leading that moment to happen to certain people and maybe even collectively at the scale of certain communities, right? So there have been instances, and we have seen this, where certain places have been very badly affected by, say, wildfires. And that has, partly as a result of lots of very good climate communication being laid down over many years, the connection is very clear to people. They're saying, oh, wow, hang on, I was warned about this potentially happening. But as you're inferring there, climate change is not just a set of worsening events. It is an era, a new condition. It affects everything. Everything is changing. And that is very worrying. And lots of people, of course, have talked, including, I'm sure, on this show, about how that can lead to things like, in the technical jargon, shifting baseline syndrome, where as every year gets more unstable, people kind of get used to that and forget what it used to be like before that instability and never really keep saying, hang on a minute, this is because of climate change. But I think that is a risk if nothing is done to try and affect the collective story that we're listening to, right? You could imagine a situation where there was a shifting baseline syndrome in the Second World War, where everyone started to be like, oh, well, Nazi dominion is now everywhere and we just sort of got used to this. There was a constant process of contextualization of saying that is a threat and it is part of this. There is therefore has to be a collective endeavour to then deal with the root causes of that threat. And so what that looks like now specifically for climate change is that we've got to get, I think, far better at communicating how climate impact is related to climate cause on these cascading risks. So when, for example, over the last couple of years, inflation in countries like ours in the UK and other countries of the world has been driven by food costs partly, which themselves have been driven by worsening climate impacts. The harvests are getting smashed up, which is leading to higher food prices, which is then filtering into the wider inflation, the wider increase in prices that people are feeling. That is complex. It is not immediately necessarily intuitive to everyone. A place burning down because of wildfires, which you were told were going to become more likely with climate change, is that much easier. These complex strands, they need to now be better communicated, I think, because that has got to give that making sense moment of what is going on, which then can create those beliefs among people of how, even though the symptoms of climate change are getting worse and I'm feeling them more and I want to just focus on the symptoms because they're things that's threatening me, I still need to be focused on the root cause.
Welcome back to Your Brain on Climate. I'm Dave, and in this episode we're talking about getting our heads around the possible end of the world. Can we? And if we can't, can our institutions, can our leaders? Now, the reason for Your Brain on Climate existing in the first place, the theme that runs through it, is the fallacies and the biases that not only stop human brains properly doing something about climate change, but help to bring it about in the first place. Pick any old episode of Your Brain on Climate, and you will learn about how individual humans just find this sort of stuff evolutionarily difficult. Climate change is a long-term, vast problem, but our brains evolve for dealing really, really well with short-term, immediate problems, like whether there's someone with an axe behind that bush. Like the first episode of Your Brain on Climate, episode 1, I talked about the psychology of how we understand risk with Adam Corner. Go back and listen to it. It's particularly interesting because we did it when COVID was still a thing. So we knew whereof we spoke about societies and how they think en masse about stuff going really wrong.
Bit tentative in saying this, but I would say like most from the numbers that have had COVID and have been ill from COVID, most of us still haven't had like very direct experience of it. Like we might have had, our phones pinged or someone we know has had it, but it's not like your own house on fire when you're, running out the door. We haven't had that direct experience. It has always mostly been mediated, not for everyone, of course, but for most people. So the construction really matters, and the construction's got to be done responsibly. I think that's the thing. I guess I think some people really sort of looked at the COVID response and were like, we'll have a bit of that for climate change, please. A bit of this, please. That'll get us going. But I don't know. I'm a bit more dubious about that.
See, when a crocodile is trying to eat us, we're all good at working out we're at risk, but most other stuff is harder. We take cues from people around us, or don't. Other people, our friends and family and people we see in the streets, and particularly from people in authority. And frankly, the more complicated the risk, the bigger that cue probably needs to be. But yet humans at the collective level can and do long-term, complex, wise things all the time. That's why we've got institutions like health services, government departments, the Met Office, even things like the insurance industry and universities. We didn't just evolve individually, is the thing. We evolved socially. We are social animals. We're collective as much as we're individual. We draw fire and inspiration from the behaviour of other people, and we can respond, therefore, powerfully with huge collective force if ideas have huge collective power and weight and people buy in, like with the pandemic. But, of course, and this feels particularly pertinent given where things are at in the world right now, the question is whether our institutions and our leaders are any more up for this than the rest of us. And the signs ain't great. I'm listening to you talking about all of these complicated overlapping risks. And as always, when I listen to you talk, Laurie, I find myself going, yeah, he's right. Of course he's right. It's really complicated. And there's all the stuff you're only mentioning a bit of it. There's all the stuff you're not talking about. You're just talking about climate. There's all the other things. But it is hard. It is really hard for my brains and most people's brains to kind of actually take into ourselves the idea that all of this could go really badly wrong really quickly. Yeah. Don't you think?
I do. Yeah, I do. And there is, a huge amount of evidence out there that shows that our brains, aren't necessarily wired to conceive of global scale polycrises. I mean, my goodness, just those words put in that order is intimidating to face up to, right? Exactly. And we can list a load of them, right? So what is it? I am not the neuroscientist here, but I do work with a very talented neuroscientist called Krista Mayer. And
the guest on the last episode of Your Brain on Climate.
Oh, well, there you go. Well, listeners, refer back to that episode and get a much more educated view on the cod psychology that I'm about to give. But we've got things like normalcy bias, right, where, often we are biased to assuming that the future will play out largely like the past has played out and the present is currently feeling. And climate change, by definition, is the opposite of that. And this is a whole other complex thing that we may go into, but a lot of the assessments and complex models that governments and, say, pension funds use to predict the future are basically based upon the future being largely like the past. And by definition, it won't be. What else have we got? We got, cognitive biases where we have in our minds ways in which, we don't think that certain things will be possible, or that the causes are not actually what they might be. There might be scope, what I think has been called scope insensitivity, where you might not be so worried about vast global scale things. You're much more interested about what's happening in your community. And there are many more, and there are others who have spoken about this. But I do, though, think that if we do look at other global scale risks in the past, people have actually been able to burst through those individual biases because they have been in the context of certain leaders or other people who basically have sway over stories at a collective level, right? Have been able to communicate in a way that helps make sense that breaks down some of those biases.
Inherent in what you're talking about here, I think a large part is being organised enough, whether you are a government or a society or an anything, to go, right, look, there's a problem coming, a massive problem, a massive set of overlapping problems coming, and we are going to do something about it, taking the threat seriously, basically. Do you find that the people that you talk to, who I assume are, in governments and in businesses, are people ready for that type of conversation? Are people generally getting ready for climate change?
People are not ready to the extent and in the ways that are needed. I was lead author on a report that we published last year called the Security Blind Spot. And that report was basically looking at how the national security parts of governments, we looked at the UK specifically, but what we found holds, we know, for a number of governments, how those national security bits face up to the climate crisis and the big risks that are now clear. And to be clear, when I say national security, I do not mean the military. I mean the bits of government that are supposed to be anticipating and responding to pandemics, right? And the COVID-19 pandemic showed us that the greatest threats to our security don't necessarily come from hostile action like war, invasion, or terrorist attacks. They can come from nature and the way we are damaging nature. And what in short, we found that there are massive blind spots, and they are similar blind spots to the ones that existed on pandemics and have been revealed by, among others, the UK government's official inquiry into the COVID-19 pandemic.
The time has now come for us all to do more. From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
We've already talked a bit about COVID. What a bonkers thing when you think about it. What a thing to have lived through. It already seems kind of unreal. Everything's shut. Most of us stayed at home. Like, overnight. One day there weren't a pandemic, then we got told there was one, then we all freaked out and started to be scared of getting a virus off people we'd have thought nothing about the day before, and a whole society did things differently. I don't want to go through that again. I'm sure you don't either. But what it wasn't, or shouldn't have been, to governments anyway, was a surprise. There was any number of reports and exercises and warnings put in front of government before COVID came along, saying that the world's well overdue a pandemic. We're hacking ever more into nature, putting us ever more into contact with God knows what illnesses from animals we should be leaving the hell alone. And in a world of global movement of people and stuff, an outbreak in one place will be around the world before you could say lurgy. It's not that people weren't thinking about it. Like in the UK in 2016, government ran a 3-day simulation exercise here in the UK to work out what would happen if a flu virus that we couldn't control rampaged through the health service. And it found out in a nutshell that we'd be stuffed. The NHS would fall over. Now, you might not have heard about that, and there's a reason for that. According to a government source quoted in the Daily Telegraph, perhaps because they were worried about a Threads moment of public alarm and outrage, the findings of that simulation were described as, quote, too terrifying to tell people about. So you would have thought that would have changed things. You know, we should have been ready in government for a pandemic, but we weren't. For a start, that simulation modelled the wrong pandemic. It modelled flu, which we kind of already knew how to treat, not a novel coronavirus that we didn't. We did kind of prepare, sort of, and had plans, but for the wrong sort of pandemic. And not enough money was spent, and not enough institutional preparedness was laid down for the near certainty, not the outside chance, but the near certainty that one day a pandemic like COVID would turn up. And the sad reality is, look, we're still not ready. We're no more ready for another one of these than we were first time. The chair of the UK's COVID inquiry said last year that
the expert evidence suggests it's not a question of if another pandemic will strike, but when. That means that the UK will again face a pandemic that, unless we are better prepared, will bring with it immense suffering and huge financial cost, and the most vulnerable in society will suffer the most.
So that's for a pandemic. That's for something we've lived through. We fully understand what it's like. We all remember what a lockdown was like. So what hope have we got for something slow burn, but era-defining, like climate change?
The idea that a lot of people have in their minds about climate change and what the risks look like is basically this, that they think that they are bad. They are largely those immediate impacts that I described earlier, the storms and the heat waves that you see on the news, and they will play out, they will get worse steadily over time. In the very long run, over decades, that is massive, but it's a slow burn thing. And right now, there are other things to worry about, like the war in Europe, wars in the Middle East, and inflation and so on. Whereas actually, climate risks are the knock-on cascading risks that we were talking about earlier, and they are not going to play out steadily over time, over a long period of time. It's going to be very chaotic and everything being thrown at us. So there's this incorrect mental model that needs to change, and then from that there's a bunch of things that they don't do institutionally that need to be done. So there has never been a national security risk assessment of climate change undertaken by the UK government. What that would look like is it says, okay, well, what's the worst that climate change could do to our food supply? What's the worst that the consequence of climate change could do to our political cohesion in the UK, right? The UK does have a climate change risk assessment, but that is a general one that's largely there to inform our plans for making our infrastructure more resilient, right? It's the thing that informs whether we need to build a flood barrier here or raise the existing one higher over there. What we're talking about is something much wider. And the reason why we ask the question, what's the worst that can happen, is because that's how we do risk assessment. And when you get on a plane, right, you want the manufacturer of that plane to not have just have worried about the average thing, the normal thing that can happen to that plane. You want it to have thought about the very worst thing and have designed it in a way that can then avoid and can handle with that worst situation. We have not asked that same question for climate change when it comes to UK society, and that's the same for many other countries around the world. And that's really important for a number of reasons. One, because if you're dealing with the very worst thing, then kind of you're getting everything covered there on down. But also because some of those things, unfortunately, are now going to happen. Like we were saying earlier, this is not just a set of events. We're now in an era of this where all these chaotic things are going to increasingly happen to us. And we want better risk assessment to know what we have to avoid. But we also need to know, like we were saying earlier with the analogy of the ship and the storm, we need better risk assessment to identify what might now be unavoidable so we can be better braced for it so it doesn't derail us from our journey to ultimately getting out of the mess that we've ended up in.
Which strikes me as a good idea for governance in general, and not just for climate change, right? I mean, we had COVID, it buggered everything up. We had an inquiry which concluded we had not really been prepared enough for this and we should be jolly well prepared again next time. Has anything changed, really?
I mean, I think, look, the fundamental thing here is that I used the analogy of a plane just now. It's relatively easy, though still very complex and difficult, as Boeing, are learning now, to redesign just a plane to deal with these threats when you do a better risk assessment, right? And Boeing has been plagued by its disasters recently. To redesign a society or a global set of societies is extremely difficult, particularly when that change will always be resisted by companies, people that are doing extremely well in the short term out of how things are going at the moment. And that is the fundamental situation we find ourselves in. So taking pandemics that you mentioned there, to really deal with pandemic risk would require large changes in diets globally to ensure that there was less of contact between human and animals, less land was disrupted, forests cut down, etc., to make way for cattle growing. All of that massively increases pandemic risk. There would then have to be changes to societies so that people became we would deal with public health issues without them being created. So people had better food, so that they didn't have problems with their weight, that they were not as poor, or at least the inequality wasn't as large, and so on and so forth. Those things have been known now for at least a century, probably longer, for how we actually deal at root with pandemic risk. The climate change is almost exactly the same, where we would have to have that big redesign. So that is what is required. And obviously loads and loads of people, so many of us are in the game of trying to push for that more redesign of society. But one of the things that I now believe is that the project of trying to do that before the fact, in a way of avoiding or preempting, is beginning to reach the end of its possibilities now. Again, let me take us back to that analogy of the ship and the storm. The best thing to do is to sail around the storm and to do make all of the changes on the boat to change the bearing. And that didn't happen. And now we're in the storm. Yes, all of the chaos can occur and we could become inundated. But, and this is the really positive side to the story, at least really where the energy then, we can then take some energy, is that we, in moments of dislocation and instability, societies become more, plastic. There are more opportunities for change. And we've seen that countless times. I mean, I think one of the greatest stories about the UK, about Britain, is that in the wake of the disasters of the First World War, of the interwar years, the Second World War, we created institutions like the National Health Service. And they were unthinkable, even a few years before they were created. But in the context of that instability and crisis, the possibilities for change opened up. And I think that that's more the model that we're now in. If you're a boat in a storm, there will be people who still say, look, storms are bad. We can batten down the hatches and see this thing out. That's not true. That's not how you get out of a storm. And it's the same here. So it's only really through moments that really shock societies that I think we will have the possibilities. And if we look back over the last couple of decades, there have been a number of these. There was the financial crisis, there was COVID. We were supposed to build back better, build back greener. And we've got to make sure that these crisis moments are no longer going to waste, because they're here to stay. And so the crucial thing will be, how can we drive that redesign of society out of then these unfortunate disaster moments that are with us?
Your brain on climate.
I've just finished reading Michael Lewis's brilliant book about the fall of the crypto billionaire Sam Bankman-Fried. If you don't know who Sam Bankman-Fried is, have a look, Google him. Strange bloke, impressive bloke in loads of ways, currently doing a long stretch for fraud. He was the richest person in the world under the age of 30. The book's called Going Infinite. I commend it to you in the strongest possible terms, like all Michael Lewis's books, to be honest. And I won't go into it too much, other than to say it makes the average bloke, me, feel very small in the face of the kind of money sloshing about in the world kind of carelessly, the riches some people have and the amount some people spend, and the fact that these things like financial markets are this beast that we create, but which has now got their own logic. It towers over us, controlling our behaviour as much as we control it. It's kind of emerged from humanity at the collective level. That kind of thing gives me a vertigo sometimes when I think about it, like the scale of human activity. Like I'm standing at the foot of some kind of vast God that only exists because people believe in it, but which has still got the power to crush me underfoot because so many people do. And it's the same, more so, with the vastness of the climate system. Humans are simultaneously small, but yet also able to have impacts on the scale of gods. And here's the thing, right? I genuinely don't know if I'd have the strength to spend all day in the interconnectedness, the colossalness, the awfulness of all of this, really getting my head around the end of the world. I tried it when I worked for a think tank for 4 years, and I nearly lost my bloody mind. As long-term listeners to my other podcast, Sustainababble, may remember, back in 2019, I quit that job. I had a proper freak out. Couldn't do it no more. And Laurie and I go way back. He was actually one of the people that helped me get back on an even keel at that point. He's someone who can sit, as you can hear, in the hugeness of it all, who can understand the gravity, take it inside himself, but keep it all together. And before we wrapped up, I wanted to ask him about that. Like, how does he do it? How does he keep on going, knowing what he knows, exploring what he explores? Is it luck? Is it skill? Is it genetics? What is it? So, look, Laurie, you and I, actually about 4 or 5 years ago now, when I was having my sort of freak out about all of this stuff, you were a good friend to me, and we had talks, and we talked about kind of resilience and how to cope with the fact that some of this stuff is massively horrible and scary, and if you spend too long in it, you can freak out and melt down. It's 5 years on, you're still doing it. So how do you get up in the morning and go to work? How do you carry on bearing the scale and the size of this and living in it?
It's a very good question. The first thing I would say is that there are lots of groups out there. This is a sort of a side point, a practical point, but there are lots of groups out there that are really helpful. The Climate Psychology Alliance is one. I'm sure you've maybe even had people on the show from there. Because this thing is extremely scary, and we need to normalize fear and other natural reactions to it. And there are lots and lots of things out there now to help with that through written resources or then even talking to people. For me, I had it was actually it was more at the beginning of COVID. I had a really hard time with my mental health. I was doing a really hard job at the time. I was setting up an organization, and I was very tired, and the world was going haywire. And it really pushed me into a place where I was very worried about some of these risks that I didn't know so much about, but I was beginning to see people talking about. Things like climate tipping points, these abrupt, potentially catastrophic moments that could be on the horizon. And it took me a bit of time to realize that one of the things that was hard there was that these risks were not being spoken about in the open. They were being left in the dark corners online, apart from the academic research, which is excellent and is out there and is very transparent. But then there wasn't enough of a conversation about what they meant, about, how we should understand those risks. And ultimately, for me, this is not a case of, am I optimistic or pessimistic? Am I hopeful? Am I not? I think we need to smash through those binaries, if we do hold them, to understand that we are now in this new condition, and it is horrifying, is maddening, particularly if you're below a certain age, because you're like, I haven't been around that long to have caused this, and particularly if you're in countries that aren't in the most fossil fuel contributing as well. But for me, the biggest struggle has always been the kind of tyranny that exists in those binaries, which is that it makes it sound like any bad news has to be followed with a clean solution, when we're not in that situation anymore. We're in a much more difficult position. And we are now in the storm, to continue to use my analogy. So I'm in the game of saying, well, now we're in that, what do we do? Because the mindset, a kind of pre-storm mindset, we can still sail around mindset, is the one that says we're doomed or we're going to be solved. There's infinite hope or infinite doom now on the horizon. It is a messy mix of both. And those binaries are not appropriate when they're in that kind of condition. And so I've always wanted to face up to this stuff, because I feel, to now answer your question directly, that I get my motivation from honesty about what we're now facing, because it is in the basis of that honesty that we can actually deliver the kind of action that's needed. And the last thing I'll leave you with on this is this, and this is what I find really motivating, because I think that the more you face up to these risks, the more you think, for example, about derailment risk, the more you can get into the real conversation now, which is how we can mitigate those risks and drive a transition in the actual destabilization that we're going to experience. And I had a really good time once working for a biographer of the British economist John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes was at the heart of the British government during the First and the Second World War. And his job was largely about how we would that the country would pay for those things. Basically, Keynes was someone who wanted to try and stop those things from happening. Very famously, after World War I, he said, we cannot make Germany pay all this vast amount of reparations money, because it will set up the conditions of impoverishment that will lead to what then became Nazism in the Second World War. As a project to avoid, Keynes kind of failed. But as a project to mobilise extraordinary action when you ended up being in the storm of the Second World War, it is a very interesting project. And he said, and this is what I find very energizing, he once said, anything we can actually do, we can afford. And it sounds banal, but basically what he was saying is this, and this is my interpretation of it for the climate crisis. So think back to being on a boat in a storm. One of the things you need to do, alongside staying focused on navigating, is move very quick. And what Keynes was saying is that at the end of the day, there are limits on what we can do. They are often physical, but there are often not limits on what we can do societally, even with our mindsets. And we see that in moments of crisis. No one was sticking their hand up in the Second World War and saying, excuse me, if we buy that extra tank, we're going to max out the credit card. Similarly, in COVID, when the UK government and others paid for everyone's wages, no one put their hand up and said, hang on a minute, how much is left on the credit card to make that happen? I mention this because we will be in more crises like that, similar ones, where everything becomes much more loose. And the critical thing with the climate crisis is that we understand that what we can actually do, we can afford. So when those crisis moments come, then we are able to make extraordinary change. Ideally, what the climate movement has been saying for decades now could have happened, which is that we worked that out before things really started to go haywire. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. And now we've got to develop a type of politics, and particularly policies, that's what I'm mainly focused on, that are able to achieve that even under these worsening conditions. Because, and this is the real stinger here, is that unlike in Keynes's, well, there was a version of this in Keynes's day, which is that there are some things that we might end up not actually being able to do. in the context of the Second World War, that was because the UK could have been invaded and our ability to prosecute the war could have been overwhelmed. In the case of the climate crisis, it is because various bits of the climate system could abruptly break down. And that can still be avoided. The critical battle now is that in these moments of worsting instability, in these signs that we're in this new era, they have got to be capitalised on to show what we can actually do and what we really can afford. And for me, the only way in which you're able to mobilise that kind of world remaking energy is if you properly peer into that very dark conversation about what those things might be coming our way in the next number of years or decades. So for me, to put it simply, a while back, I went on the UK government's website. There's a pension bit of the website where you can put in your birthday and it tells you when you're supposed to retire. And I did this and it told me that under the current policies, I am expected to retire at the end of the 2050s. And it made me realise that all of these environmental goals, net zero, etc., that the world has set, that the UK has set, they have to be achieved before my career's ended, let alone by the time I might die. And it made me realise that on one hand, I was hugely motivated to play a role, however small, in doing that, right? In seeing that project through. But when you understand that that has to occur in your career, within your career, that, you know, my retirement thing should happen at the end of the decade in which we delivered these things, you know. And when you realise that, you think, well, hang on a minute, what is the strategic context? What's the world going to be like? How's it going to change over the course of that? And how could we be derailed from that? And I think that is the thing that had a really bad impact on my mental health, is that I couldn't find people who wanted to have that conversation, to say, yep, we agree, we know climate change is bad, we know we can do these things, we know we need to do them quickly, but we're not talking about the challenges and conditions, the potholes along the way, the storm that we're going to have to navigate, that we have to do along the way. And it was the absence of that I found particularly difficult. I know that's different for other people, but it was in being focused on that really got me energized, because it's that long haul that I'm in for, and I want to have that conversation about how we can best navigate it.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Your Brain on Climate. I hope you enjoyed it. I know there was some big stuff in there, but hopefully some inspiring stuff as well. A huge thanks to Laurie for such a smart, human chat. Check out the Strategic Climate Risks Initiative and all Laurie's work for more. If you'd like to support this one-man operation, that'd be really, really kind of you. I do all the work, I do the editing, I also pay my guests, that's important to me, I respect their time. So it'd be really kind of you if you wanted to chuck in a couple of quid to help keep this show on the road. You can go to patreon.com/YourBrainOnClimate to donate. Probably best to use that web address rather than the Patreon iOS app, unless you really, really like giving Apple a massive cut of your money, which, you know, I don't know why you would. Thank you to Alan, to John and to Laura for joining the Patreon club in the last month. You're my new heroes. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who's chipped in for longer. There's too many of you to name, albeit not enough. Or look, drop me an email to hello@yourbrainonclimate.com if you'd like to donate some other way, or just generally want to give me any feedback on the show. Please share, please rate and review. You've got no idea how important and how much help that is for a small indie podcast. Thanks as always to Ruth Everett for the voice. Thank you again to Laurie for coming on. That's all for now. I'll be back soon. Thanks so much for listening all the way to the end. Please look after yourself. Okay, bye.